Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to be talking about MDMA and sexual desire. The required readings for this week were the effects on methamphetamine and MDMA on the appraisal of pictures of erotic stimuli. The question that we want to focus on this week is about MDMA and the increase in a person's sexual desire, specifically with sexual stimuli in a controlled setting. And this is important because the study that we're going to look at was specific to viewing sexual stimuli in a controlled setting. But also, does that MDMA lend itself to sexual stimuli more so than a placebo or methylphenidate? And the reason MDMA was chosen was because the openness that's created by the experience on MDMA. And so in the next slide, I'm going to show a video based on a study that was recently done and something that the psychedelic community has been looking at for a while and excited about. And that's this idea that MDMA creates a vulnerability that no other drug does with such few symptoms and so few repercussions. It's non-addictive, and people will take it 1 to 3 times for a study and never feel that they need to take it again and have a really incredible once-in-a-lifetime experience that really changes their mindset. And so when thinking about those things, it's important to understand that the vulnerability that comes from MDMA is on an interpersonal level and on a personal level, and that may lend itself to many different studies. But what I really want us to focus on is, does it lend itself to the sexual stimuli and people viewing sexual pictures? So let's watch the next video and then we'll go from there.
So I'm really excited today to talk to you about my research about couples who take MDMA together and what I'm going to call this emotional bubble, which I will explain in a moment, that couples experience when they kind of take MDMA together. So onto the data, the juicy part. So couples described what I said earlier as a kind of emotional bubble forming around them on MDMA, and that was somewhere they felt safe, where they had a place to be vulnerable, where they were kind of more in tune with their emotions and they could express those emotions better as well. And it was largely insulated from kind of fear or worry or anger, though not completely. I use this metaphor of a bubble because, a bubble denotes like a separate space, but it's also kind of transparent, so it's not completely blocked off from real world concerns. And just as a bubble pops, MDMA experiences inevitably come to an end. And just as bubbles can kind of leave behind a sort of residue or a trace, so too do MDMA experiences, and that's what the couples describe them as doing. So it seems interesting that, as a drug, and one long associated with kind of the summer of love, with raving, with hedonism, that MDMA can often be equated in research with some form of escapism, but that really doesn't seem to be what's happening here at all. Emily's not talking about, taking MDMA with Dan and they're just sort of escaping or they're avoiding all their problems. Instead, she's talking about taking MDMA with him, and then these problems are actually aired between them. They're processed, they're dealt with to some degree, and they're wiped away, and they have this clean slate. And not only that, having this kind of clean slate then motivates them to continue to kind of bring that open, honest communication in their everyday lives together as well. I think what's also really interesting about what Nick says, I think it really speaks to the kind of conflicting cultural pressures that exist for men. So on the one hand, you have this idea of having a kind of masculine identity, of being strong, of not being emotionally vulnerable. And then on the other hand, there's sort of a growing expectation that men too will share their feelings, particularly in romantic relationships. And taking MDMA for Nick seems to allow him to kind of navigate these two opposing pressures and just be more emotionally available for his partner, which leads to what he later describes as a healthier kind of relationship. And this is really kind of replicated, this sort of idea of male partners becoming more emotionally available, more emotionally vulnerable, was really replicated across the data set. So half of the women I interviewed talked about how they really enjoyed the kind of more emotional side to their male partners in MDMA. And this seems particularly significant benefit of MDMA and couples in particular when you think about how research has found women often cite a lack of emotional intimacy as a major reason for getting divorced from a male partner. So to sum up, to really take home from this talk, that MDMA changes not just individuals, but how couples relate to each other on an emotional level. And this doesn't say confined to taking MDMA together, it kind of ripples out into their everyday lives. It provides a reminder to be more affectionate, to be more honest together maybe. And it also can change how one person's kind of a more emotional sense of self and changes them to become more emotionally vulnerable with their partner in everyday life too. And this has a couple of sort of main implications. So therapists who are working with couples, this is general therapists who are working with couples who've taken MDMA together, give them sort of insights on the experiences people have had together. And also, rather optimistically, in a utopian future where we have MDMA-assisted couples therapy, I think that would be could provide possible support for that as well. Thank you very much.
So what I find really important about that clip and those findings is the openness of MDMA creates a vulnerability that can be very powerful, and especially from a psychology perspective, from the psychedelic community, and we don't want to misuse that. It's important to study it, and it's important to push science forward in that sense, but it's powerful, and there are incredible ways to use it, like bringing these couples closer together. So I want to talk about what MDMA is and what MDMA is not. MDMA in its pure form is a chemical substance. It's made in a lab. It is a pure substance, not mixed with anything else, which is more important to understand. It's taken orally in a powder pill form. The experience with one dose lasts about 4 to 6 hours, and the increase in serotonin levels creates that enhanced openness and would be described as a euphoric experience, one that the psychedelic community would call an ego death. And what that means is that all your defenses are down, which again is why it's so incredible for personal discovery and growth, as well as discovery and growth with your significant other or people around you, your therapist. When your defenses are down, you're able to really explore and discuss things that otherwise might not even come up because we are constantly protecting ourselves. And so it's also important to note what MDMA is not. While ecstasy and Molly and a quote-unquote party drug are types of MDMA and might have MDMA in them, these are things you're getting off the street because it is illegal. And they will typically be cut or filled with something else as well, have a filler in them. And that unknown substance might be a stimuli or a stimulant rather, and it might be something non-harmful, but it's important to understand that your experience is going to be completely different, and without understanding the dosage and without really knowing the dosage, getting it off the street, it's impossible to know that you're going into a clean experience as you would with pure MDMA in a clinical setting currently. So the study also gave methylphenidate to the participants. And I just want to explain what that is. So it's known to us in more of a widespread way as Ritalin, which is prescribed to people who have ADHD. It's a stimulant for your central nervous system. So the effect that this is going to have on an individual is giving the feeling of being up, awake, excited, focused. For people with ADHD who have trouble getting energy and focusing that energy in the proper place. So this, in some settings, might be compared to something even as strong as cocaine or meth in an illegal tendency. So, but for pharmaceutical purposes, it is Ritalin, and that is important to our study because not only is it completely different from MDMA, but it's also giving the effect that would be perfect for a visual stimuli situation of being awake and focused. You are going to be very attentive, as opposed to on MDMA. While you might be attentive, you're also experiencing a physical experience. You're having deeper thoughts, which might take you away from the task at hand. So what was the hypothesis here? The researchers predicted a lot of things, but what we want to focus in on was that they predicted a feeling of closeness and openness to others that MDMA enhances. And so they predicted that because of that, it would also enhance sexual desire. And they came to this hypothesis because of the serotonin levels that allows for a natural increase in sex drive. But it's important to also note that this hypothesis comes from a place of self-report for many years of people taking MDMA in their home with loved ones at a party where they were physically touching people or themselves. And so that experience is going to be totally different than a controlled setting in a lab. What does sex drive look like when looking at a screen, as opposed to when you're in the comfort of your home with your significant other? So the method, they had 30 participants, 15 men, 15 women. It was placebo, double-blind, randomized. Each participant received MDMA, methylphenidate, and a placebo during 3 separate rounds. They would receive all 3 at one point during this. And it was separated by at least 7 days, which is really important because there are symptoms from MDMA and even methylphenidate that need to wear off so that you can experience the new drug. So especially in MDMA trials, it's really important to have that time in between doses. And how and what did they measure? So again, we're just looking at a very specific task that they gave them. They were given a drug, one of the 3, and then they were shown pictures of neutral, implicit, and explicit sexual pictures. And so the subtask that we want to focus in on is the arousal subtask. And what they did was they would see a picture for a certain amount of time, and they would rate it on a 9-point scale for different things: pleasant, arousing, excited, attractive, likable, erotic. Again, we're going to focus in on the arousing, excited category and also the erotic category. So I covered up all the numbers that we don't need to look at. What's interesting but not surprising about the results is that the methylphenidate scored significantly higher than both the placebo and the MDMA for the arousing, exciting category and erotic stimuli category. And again, this isn't surprising because methylphenidate is a stimulant. It gives you the focused experience that I was discussing before, and especially in comparison to MDMA, where you want to be with another human, methylphenidate is not concerned about another human. You're really focused on a task. And when you understand the difference of these two drugs, it's not surprising that all the ratings are significantly higher for the methylphenidate than the MDMA. Just looking at the implicit sexual pictures, on average, people were scoring the arousal 6.13, while scoring the MDMA at looking at these pictures at a 5.95. It doesn't seem like a huge difference, but it is an average and it is a significant difference, a significant p-value difference. And like I said, this isn't a surprising takeaway when you really understand the difference between the two drugs. So I want to discuss the drawbacks because I think that that's really important to this study. It's actually kind of confusing to me why they would choose these two drugs, and there wasn't a lot of explanation in the study as to why these were the two that they decided to pick. They might both be stimulants, but in completely different ways, so maybe that could be the reasoning. But what are the drawbacks? So if we're specifically looking at MDMA, which creates a closeness, the drawbacks are really just viewing sexual stimuli. How is that going to affect the results? Well, if they're looking just to focus in on a picture and they're giving a drug that might take away from focus, then it's not surprising that the ratings are going to be lower when you're taking MDMA. That's going to affect your results because the two drugs are totally different. MDMA creates a want to be with other people and have deep conversation, not look at a screen. So would it be ethical to give MDMA and observe a couple and their physical intimacy if we dosed it and said, just feel it out and see how it is touching one another, and then give a placebo and see how that is? I don't think that the methylphenidate is necessary in this scenario, but if that is something that the researchers wanted to look at, then sure, what is the difference then when people are interacting? Because then we can really look at the therapeutic benefits of giving these drugs to individuals and couples. So just to wrap up and what I believe the follow-up study should be. First of all, I don't think that the MDMA should be directly compared to the methylphenidate. If anything, maybe there should be a comparison of the MDMA and placebo to the methylphenidate and placebo when viewing stimuli. But I think that the visual stimuli is very problematic for reasons that I've already stated. It would also, as I said, be interested to see how people rate physical touch on MDMA and then separately on methylphenidate. I think that the fact that they're stimulants may lend themselves to sex in general, but methylphenidate is something that people take on a daily basis, and MDMA is something that people might take once in a lifetime. And as I said in the beginning, because of that, the power of MDMA, I think that this might be a study that is a dead end for that reason. Methylphenidate is prescribed to people every day. I think we could probably do a study on how those people experience sex before and after taking the drug, before being prescribed to it, and then while they're on it. I think that taking methylphenidate probably has a increased result across the board on all visual stimuli. So it would be really interesting to see how looking at with a placebo, looking at any type of picture as opposed to methylphenidate, any type of picture, I think the stimulant from that would just increase in general. And so, just in conclusion, I think for sex purposes, there's a lot of research that we should be doing with MDMA on a interpersonal level and a personal level. I think that it can connect people to themselves and work through the trauma that they have sexually, because it opens you up to have conversations without your defenses up. That being said, I think that there's something really important in bonding couples with MDMA. So I think that, as I said, this study might be more of a dead end than anything else. But of course, it's always important to compare everyday pharmaceuticals to something that hopefully will one day be available to everyone, like MDMA. But as far as human sexuality goes, MDMA has so much potential, and it's really important that going forward, we take the time and really understand that potential, because this could potentially save a lot of people from their own sexual trauma, as well as the sexual trauma that they have with a partner or their community. And there's endless possibilities in there. If I were to add this to our human sexuality class, I might put it after the sexual health week, because I think that it could play into a lot of the discussions we were having that week on how sex was taught to us. That creates a lot of sexual trauma, a lot of sexual confusion. And I think that that's something that MDMA is going to be really helpful for in the next 10 years when it starts to become more widespread in therapy. There's a lot of people that have difficulty with sex on a personal and interpersonal level just because they can't connect sexually with themselves or anyone else due to our society and due to upbringing. So I think that the idea of how drugs impact sex would really play well into our sexual health week. Thank you.